There is a particular kind of woman who holds a family together not through authority or demand, but simply through presence. Margaret Elena Torres was that kind of woman. At 59 years old, she was the sort of person whose kitchen always smelled like something was already on the stove, whose voicemail greeting made you smile before you even left a message, and whose laugh, low, unhurried, genuine, could quiet a room in the best possible way. She was not a woman who sought attention. She simply had a gift for making whoever stood closest to her feel like the most important person in the world. Margaret had lived her entire adult life in Clarkdale, Arizona, a small desert town tucked against the red rock formations of the Verde Valley. It was the kind of place where the sunsets looked painted, and the community bulletin board at the local church still announced casserole drives and choir rehearsals. She had moved there as a young bride in the late 1980s, following her husband, Ernesto Torres, who had taken a foreman position at a copper processing plant outside of town. They built their life there slowly, deliberately, a small house on Mesquite Lane with a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, a garden that Ernesto insisted on planting every spring despite the unforgiving Arizona soil, and eventually, a son. Daniel Ernesto Torres was born in April 1993. He was their only child, not by design, but by circumstance, and perhaps because of that, he became everything to both of them. From his earliest years, Daniel was the kind of child that neighbors pointed to as an example. Polite, helpful, never in trouble. He carried groceries for elderly women on the block, without being asked. He stayed after school to help teachers stack chairs. He called his mother every Sunday without exception, even during his college years at Arizona State University, where he studied business administration and graduated without incident. Ernesto Torres died of a heart attack in 2014, when Daniel was 21 years old. The loss reshaped everything. Margaret, who had built her identity around the unit of 3, suddenly found herself reduced to a unit of 1. Daniel stepped into the space his father had left with what everyone described as remarkable devotion. He moved back to Clarkdale after graduation. He took a sales management position at a regional equipment company in Cottonwood, close enough to commute. He checked on his mother daily. He fixed things around the house on weekends. He drove her to doctor appointments and sat in waiting rooms without complaint, scrolling his phone in silence while she filled out forms. The women at St. Anthony's Parish, where Margaret volunteered every Wednesday helping organize food donations, talked about Daniel with open admiration. "That boy is 1 in a million," said Patricia Nunez, who had known Margaret for over 2 decades. "You see sons like that in the movies, not in real life." Margaret never contradicted anyone who praised him. She simply smiled the way mothers do when they know something wonderful belongs to them. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small dental practice on Main Street, a job she had held for 11 years. She liked the routine, liked the small office gossip, liked the walk from the parking lot each morning when the desert air was still cool. Her boss, Dr. Yolanda Reyes, described her as irreplaceable, not just because she was meticulous with numbers, but because she remembered everyone's birthday, kept fresh flowers on the front desk, and made the waiting room feel less clinical just by being in it. Margaret was not a woman without worries. Since Ernesto's death, money had never been entirely comfortable. The house was paid off, which helped, but between her part-time income and a modest widow's pension, there was not much room for error. A few years after Ernesto passed, she had taken out a life insurance policy, $250,000, at the suggestion of her financial advisor. It was a precaution, she told people. Something to leave behind to make sure whoever needed it would be taken care of. She named Daniel as sole beneficiary. He was her son. It was the obvious choice. It was the only choice. Daniel, by the time he reached his early 30s, had cultivated an image that was nearly flawless. He was present at every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday. He posted photographs with his mother on social media, with captions that drew dozens of comments. Heart emojis, declarations that he was the best son, little bursts of warmth from people who had never met either of them, but were moved by what they saw. He was handsome in a quiet way, dark hair kept neat, eyes that held contact long enough to make people feel heard. He was well liked at work. He coached a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings at the local recreation center. He seemed, in every observable dimension, to be exactly what he appeared to be. What no one in Clarkdale knew, not Patricia Nunez, not Dr. Reyes, not the parents of the children on the soccer team, was that Daniel Torres had accumulated over $90,000 in personal debt across 4 credit cards and 2 private loans he had taken out in the 18 months prior to the spring of 2024. The debt was not the result of medical emergencies or catastrophic misfortune. It was the product of a gambling habit that had migrated from weekend poker nights to online platforms that were available every hour of every day. He had hidden it carefully. He paid the minimum balances. He kept the statements paperless. He answered questions about money with the relaxed confidence of someone who had none. By March of 2024, 2 of the credit accounts were in collections. One of the lenders had sent a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action. Daniel's salary, which was comfortable but not extraordinary, could not absorb what he owed. He had explored the idea of a personal loan consolidation and been declined. He had considered approaching his mother, but could not find a way to frame a request large enough to solve the problem without revealing the full scale of what he had done. Margaret's life insurance policy was $250,000. He was the sole beneficiary. He knew the policy terms. He had, in fact, been the one to remind her to renew it 2 years earlier. Nobody saw what was building inside that small house on Mesquite Lane. Margaret kept tending her garden and walking to work and sitting in the front pew at St. Anthony's every Sunday. Daniel kept calling. He kept stopping by. He kept fixing things. Mother's Day that year fell on the 2nd Sunday of May. Daniel told everyone who would listen that he had something special planned. Mother's Day in Clarkdale arrived the way it always did in the Verde Valley, with a sky so blue it looked artificial and a morning heat that built slowly from the east, rolling off the red rock formations like something alive. By 9 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed past 78 degrees. By noon, it would feel like the desert was breathing. Margaret woke early that Sunday. She had slept well, which she noted with quiet gratitude because sleep had been inconsistent in recent weeks. Small things had been bothering her. Fatigue that arrived in the afternoons without warning. A persistent nausea she attributed to a change in her blood pressure medication. A general heaviness she described to her friend Patricia as feeling like she was carrying something she couldn't put down. She had mentioned it to Dr. Reyes in passing, and her doctor had suggested they schedule blood work. Margaret had agreed and then postponed it twice, the way people do when they are not quite ready to hear an answer. She dressed carefully that morning, a blue linen blouse she saved for church occasions and a pair of tan slacks. She put on the small gold earrings Ernesto had given her on their 20th anniversary. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment longer than usual, the way people sometimes do without knowing why, as if something in them is paying attention even when the mind is elsewhere. Daniel arrived at 10:30. He pulled into the driveway of Mesquite Lane in his white pickup truck with the back seat occupied by several bags, a box, and what appeared to be a wrapped item long enough to be a painting or a framed photograph. He came through the front door the way he always did, without knocking, calling out her name before he was fully inside, filling the small entryway with his energy. He had brought flowers, not a grocery store bouquet wrapped in plastic, but an actual arrangement, deep red carnations, white lilies, and sprigs of eucalyptus in a glass vase he had purchased separately. He set it on the kitchen table with deliberate care, adjusting it twice until the angle satisfied him. He had also brought food, a full homemade brunch assembled the night before, packed in containers and carefully labeled. Huevos rancheros with a tomatillo salsa he said he had made from scratch. Fresh fruit. A small loaf of pan dulce from the Mexican bakery in Cottonwood that Margaret had loved since Daniel was a child. He had thought of everything, and he made sure she noticed. Margaret noticed. She held his face in both hands when she thanked him, the way she had done since he was small, pressing her palms against his cheeks and looking at him directly. He smiled. He told her she looked beautiful. She told him he was too good to her. Neither of them said anything that would suggest otherwise. They ate together at the kitchen table. Daniel served everything and insisted she sit while he moved between the counter and the stove, reheating portions, refilling her coffee, asking whether the salsa was too spicy. The conversation was easy. He asked about the women at the parish, about Dr. Reyes, about whether the neighbor's dog had stopped getting into her garden. She told him small stories she had been saving the way she always did, little pieces of her week that she knew he would find amusing. He laughed at the right moments. He asked follow-up questions. He was, by every external measure, completely present. At some point during the meal, Daniel poured her a glass of horchata from a container he had brought. He poured it himself, setting the glass directly in front of her. Margaret drank it slowly, the way she took most things, without urgency, with appreciation. She said it tasted slightly different from the usual, a little more bitter at the finish, and Daniel told her the bakery had changed their recipe. She accepted that without further thought. She trusted him the way people trust the things that have always been constant. After brunch, he brought in the wrapped item from the truck. It was a framed canvas print, a photograph Margaret had always loved, one taken at a family reunion in 1998 when Ernesto was still alive. The three of them stood in front of a lake in northern Arizona, squinting against the sun, arms around each other, all laughing at something just outside the frame. Daniel had it professionally restored and enlarged. Margaret sat with it in her lap for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. They spent the afternoon together on the porch. The desert stretched out beyond the edge of the property, scrubby and vast and beautiful in the way that only people who have lived alongside it can properly appreciate. Daniel sat in the chair that had always been his father's. Margaret rocked slowly in hers. They talked about Ernesto, the way they occasionally allowed themselves to, not with the full weight of grief, but with the softer version that time produces, a kind of fond ache rather than an open wound. By 4 in the afternoon, Margaret was tired. She did not try to hide it. The fatigue had returned with more authority than usual, settling into her limbs like something heavy. She told Daniel she thought she might lie down for a short while. He said of course. He cleaned the kitchen while she rested. She could hear him from the bedroom, the sound of water running and dishes being stacked, familiar and reassuring. She fell asleep quickly. Daniel stayed in the house for another hour. He moved quietly from room to room. He checked his phone several times. At 5:47 in the afternoon, he sent a text message to his cousin Rosa that read, "Spent the whole day with Mom. She's napping now. She seemed really tired today, more than usual." Rosa responded with a heart emoji and told him he was wonderful. At 6:15, he left. He locked the front door with his key from the outside and drove back toward Cottonwood. Margaret did not wake up when he left. She did not wake up when the neighbor's sprinklers came on at 7. She did not wake up when the light shifted and the desert sky turned the deep orange-red it became every evening over the Verde Valley, the color Ernesto had always called the most honest thing about Arizona. At 8:40 in the evening, Patricia Nunez called to wish Margaret a happy Mother's Day. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Patricia tried again 20 minutes later. Voicemail again. She told herself Margaret had probably fallen asleep on the couch, the way she sometimes did after a long Sunday, and that she would call her in the morning. She did not call in the morning. She drove over instead, at just after 7 a.m., because something she could not name had kept her from sleeping well. The front door was locked. Patricia knocked 3 times. She called Margaret's name through the door. She walked around to the side of the house and looked through the kitchen window. The table was clean. The vase of carnations and lilies sat precisely where Daniel had placed it the day before, still fresh, still arranged. She tried the back door. It was unlocked. She found Margaret in the bedroom. She was on her side, fully clothed, one hand resting beneath her cheek, as though she had simply drifted off. The photograph of the family at the lake was propped against the nightstand, facing the bed. Margaret Torres was not sleeping. Patricia called 911 at 7:19 in the morning. The operator kept her on the line. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and answered the questions she was asked in a voice that didn't sound like hers, her eyes fixed on the gold earrings Margaret still had on, the ones Ernesto had given her on their 20th anniversary. The paramedics arrived within 9 minutes. They confirmed what Patricia already knew. Margaret Elena Torres, 59 years old, bookkeeper, volunteer, gardener, the woman everyone in Clarkdale called Blessed, was dead. The first officer on the scene noted the date in his report, Mother's Day, May 12, 2024. He also noted something else, something small enough to overlook, significant enough to record. On the kitchen counter beside the sink Daniel had cleaned so carefully, there was an empty container that had held the horchata. Next to it, a single measuring spoon that no one had put away. He photographed both and included them in the initial scene documentation. He did not know yet that those 2 objects would become the center of everything that followed. The Yavapai County Medical Examiner's office was a 40-minute drive from Clarkdale, down through the valley and into Prescott, where the elevation changed and the air carried the faint smell of pine that always surprised people who associated Arizona exclusively with desert. Dr. Serena Okafor had worked in that office for 11 years. She had seen deaths that looked like accidents and turned out to be homicides, deaths that looked like homicides and turned out to be accidents, and deaths that looked like nothing at all until the laboratory told her otherwise. She had learned, across those 11 years, to treat every body that arrived on her table as a question that had not yet been answered. Margaret Torres arrived on a Monday morning. The preliminary information accompanying her was brief. 59-year-old woman, found unresponsive at her residence, no signs of trauma, no forced entry, no immediately apparent cause of death. Her physician had declined to sign the death certificate without further evaluation, citing the recent complaints Margaret had reported, the fatigue, the nausea, the general physical deterioration, and the fact that the scheduled blood work had never been completed. That was enough to bring her to Serena. The external examination revealed nothing dramatic. Margaret showed none of the blunt force indicators, none of the ligature marks, none of the petechial hemorrhaging associated with suffocation. She appeared, in the language of initial assessments, to be a middle-aged woman who had died quietly in her sleep. The kind of death that, in a different context, might have been called peaceful. But Serena was not a woman who settled for appearances. She ordered a full, toxicological panel. It was not an unusual decision. In cases where cause of death was unclear and the deceased had recent unexplained symptoms, a comprehensive tox screen was standard procedure. She noted the request in her file, assigned it to the lab, and moved on to the rest of her morning. The results came back on Thursday. Serena read them twice before she called the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. Margaret Torres's blood work showed elevated concentrations of thallium, a heavy metal with no legitimate presence in the human body, tasteless, odorless, and historically one of the most difficult poisons to detect, precisely because it produced symptoms that mimicked a range of ordinary medical conditions. Fatigue, nausea, neurological deterioration, hair loss, peripheral neuropathy. in the weeks or months before death. A person being slowly poisoned with thallium would present to any general practitioner as someone dealing with a stress-related illness, a thyroid condition, or the side effects of medication. They would be told to rest, to hydrate, to come back in a month. The concentration in Margaret's system was not at the level of a single lethal dose. It was consistent with repeated smaller exposures administered over a period of weeks. Someone had been giving it to her gradually, carefully, in amounts designed to accumulate rather than to kill all at once. Serena included that assessment in her report with clinical precision. She did not speculate. She documented what the science showed. The cause of death was thallium poisoning. The manner of death was homicide. Detective Raymond Cortez received the call from the medical examiner's office on a Thursday afternoon. He was 52 years old, 24 years with the sheriff's department, the last 9 as a homicide investigator. He was not a man given to visible reaction. He listened to Serena's summary, asked 3 clarifying questions, wrote 7 words in his notebook, and then sat for a moment looking at what he had written before he picked up the phone again. He requested the complete case file. He requested the scene documentation from the initial response. He read the attending officer's notes about the kitchen counter, the empty horchata container, the measuring spoon set slightly apart from where it should have been. He pulled up the officer's photographs on his department laptop and looked at both objects for a long time. Then he ran a background check on every person documented as having been in contact with Margaret Torres in the days preceding her death. Daniel Torres's name was first on the list. He was her son. He had been with her all day on the day she died. He had prepared and served her food and drink. He had been the last person to see her alive. Raymond drove to Clarkdale the following morning. He did not call ahead. He stopped first at St. Anthony's Parish, where he spoke with Patricia Nunez for 40 minutes. Patricia was cooperative in the way of people who have not yet understood that cooperation means surrendering something. She talked about Margaret with open grief, describing her routines, her personality, her relationship with Daniel. When Raymond asked her to characterize that relationship specifically, Patricia was emphatic. Daniel was devoted, she said. Absolutely devoted. She had never seen anything but tenderness between them. Raymond wrote that down. He spoke next with Dr. Yolanda Reyes, who confirmed the timeline of Margaret's recent symptoms. She had first mentioned the fatigue in late February. The nausea had appeared in early March. By April, she had seemed markedly diminished, quieter, slower, less like herself. Dr. Reyes expressed regret that she had not pushed harder on the blood work appointment. Raymond told her the delay had not been her fault. He said it in a tone that meant something slightly different from what the words conveyed. He visited the dental practice's parking lot after leaving, sat in his car, and calculated the timeline. If symptoms had begun in late February, and if thallium accumulated gradually over multiple exposures, the poisoning would have started in January at the earliest, possibly earlier. It had been deliberate, sustained, and carefully managed to avoid triggering alarm. That evening, he made his first direct contact with Daniel Torres. He called him on his cell phone and identified himself as a detective with the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. He said he was following up on Margaret's death as part of a standard process in unattended deaths. He used that word, standard, with precision. He asked Daniel if he would be willing to come in for a conversation at the Cottonwood substation the following morning. Daniel said of course. He said he wanted to do anything he could to help. His voice was steady and warm and expressed exactly the right amount of residual grief. Not so much as to seem performed, not so little as to seem cold. Raymond noted that too. The interview lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Daniel arrived on time, dressed neatly, and declined the offer of water twice before accepting it on the third offer. A small detail Raymond filed away without comment. He answered every question without hesitation. He described the Mother's Day visit with the fluency of someone who had already narrated it several times. The flowers, the brunch, the framed photograph, the afternoon on the porch. He mentioned that Margaret had seemed tired. He said he had been worried about her lately. He said he wished he had stayed longer. Raymond asked him about the horchata. Daniel said he had brought it from the bakery in Cottonwood. He said his mother had always loved their horchata. He said he wasn't sure why there was a measuring spoon near the container. He hadn't noticed it. Raymond did not tell him what the toxicology results had shown. He thanked Daniel for his time, walked him to the door of the substation, and watched him drive away in the white pickup truck. Back at his desk, he submitted a formal request for Daniel's financial records. He also contacted the Arizona Department of Insurance to request the complete file on Margaret Torres's life insurance policy. Every document, every correspondence, every notation. He received Daniel's credit records 48 hours later. The 4 maxed-out credit cards, the 2 delinquent loans, the collection notices, the online gambling transactions that appeared on 3 separate accounts. Hundreds of them, stretching back 18 months in an unbroken line. Raymond laid the financial documents beside the toxicology report on his desk. He looked at both for a moment. Then he looked at the date on the life insurance policy. Margaret had renewed it 8 months ago, in September of the previous year, at Daniel's suggestion. Raymond closed the folder, straightened the edges against his desk, and began drafting the warrant application. The search warrant for Daniel Torres's residence was signed by a Yavapai County judge on a Tuesday morning, 18 days after Margaret's death. Raymond Cortez executed it that same afternoon, arriving at Daniel's apartment in Cottonwood with 2 deputies and a forensic technician. Daniel was not home. He was at work, which Raymond had confirmed before leaving the substation. He preferred it that way. The apartment was orderly in the manner of someone who understood that appearances required maintenance. Dishes stacked, surfaces wiped, nothing visibly out of place. But disorder, Raymond had learned across 2 decades of investigative work, rarely announced itself. It hid in drawers, in browser histories, in the seams between what a person showed the world and what they did when no one was watching. The forensic technician worked through the kitchen first. Inside a cabinet above the refrigerator, behind 2 rarely used mixing bowls and a box of cocoa powder, she found a small glass vial, unlabeled, approximately 1/3 full of a fine whitish powder. She photographed it in place before bagging it. She found nothing else of immediate significance in the kitchen, but the vial was enough. Raymond moved through the bedroom while she worked. In the nightstand drawer, he found 3 things of interest. A printed copy of Margaret's life insurance policy with specific clauses highlighted in yellow marker, a handwritten note listing what appeared to be dosage intervals in a column format, small numbers beside dates spanning from January through early May, and a burner phone, prepaid, that showed a series of text exchanges with an unregistered number. The messages discussed pricing, delivery, and a product referred to only as tea. The most recent message was dated 6 weeks before Mother's Day. He bagged all 3 items without expression. On Daniel's laptop, which the technician imaged on site, the browser history revealed 14 visits over 4 months to a darknet procurement site, accessible through a privacy browser Daniel had installed and apparently believed was sufficient protection. The site specialized in chemical compounds. Thallium sulfate, the specific compound identified in Margaret's toxicology, appeared in the order history 3 times. The shipping addresses used were a private mailbox service in Flagstaff, registered under a variation of Daniel's middle name. Raymond drove to Flagstaff the following morning. The mailbox service had records. The attendant, a college student working part-time, remembered the name because the customer had always paid in cash and always collected packages personally rather than having them held. He identified Daniel from a photograph without hesitation. The financial picture that assembled itself over the following week was methodical and devastating. Daniel's debt had reached a point of structural collapse by December of the previous year. 2 lenders had initiated formal collection proceedings. 1 had contacted an attorney. His credit score had fallen to a level that made conventional borrowing impossible. His salary, after minimum debt payments, left him approximately $400 a month for living expenses. The life insurance policy on his mother was worth $250,000. There was no ambiguity about what that sum represented against the backdrop of what he owed. Investigators also obtained records from the online gambling platforms Daniel had used. The pattern they revealed was not that of someone who gambled recreationally and lost track. It was the pattern of someone chasing losses with escalating desperation. Larger bets, longer sessions, deposits made within hours of previous withdrawals. The platforms flagged his account internally as high risk 8 months before Margaret's death. No one had contacted him. The platforms were not designed to intervene. Raymond requested Daniel's cell phone records independently of the phone itself. The records showed a call made to the darknet supplier's number, later traced through the prepaid registration chain, on January 3rd, 2 days after the new year. That was the first contact. The first thallium shipment had arrived in Flagstaff 17 days later. Margaret's symptoms had begun in February. The warrant for Daniel's arrest was signed on a Friday. Raymond had requested it with a 38-page affidavit that laid out the evidence in chronological sequence. The financial motive, the procurement trail, the physical evidence recovered from the apartment, the toxicology, and the timeline that placed the poisoning as beginning no later than late January. He had included the highlighted insurance policy and the handwritten dosage notes as exhibits. The judge reviewed the affidavit for 20 minutes before signing. Daniel Torres was arrested the following Monday morning in the parking lot of the equipment company where he worked, as he walked from his truck toward the building's entrance. Raymond approached him directly and identified himself. Daniel's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, something that might have been fear, before settling into a careful blankness. He said nothing. He placed his hands behind his back without being instructed to do so. He was handcuffed, walked to the patrol vehicle, and driven to the county detention facility in Prescott. A colleague from the office watched from the building's glass entrance as the patrol car pulled out of the parking lot. She would tell a reporter 3 weeks later that Daniel had looked, in that moment, like someone stepping into a role he had already rehearsed. Calm, controlled, like he had known this was coming and had decided long ago how he would behave when it finally arrived. The charges filed by the Yavapai County Attorney's Office were first-degree murder and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Daniel Torres pleaded not guilty. He had, after all, been playing a long game. He was not ready to stop. The trial of Daniel Ernesto Torres opened on a gray Monday in February 2025, 9 months after Margaret's death, in the Yavapai County Superior Court in Prescott. The courtroom was full in the way that small community trials tend to be, not with journalists and cameras, but with people who had known Margaret personally, women from St. Anthony's Parish, colleagues from the dental practice, neighbors from Mesquite Lane. Patricia Nunez sat in the second row every single day, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carrying the particular stillness of someone who has already done their grieving and arrived now only for the record. The prosecution was led by Senior Deputy County Attorney Diane Faulkner, a precise and unhurried woman who had spent 20 years trying cases in Arizona state courts. She did not open with emotion. She opened with a sequence of dates: January 3rd, January 20th, late February, March, April, May 12th, and asked the jury to remember them because by the end of the trial, those dates would form the complete shape of what Daniel Torres had done. The defense attorney, a private criminal lawyer named Stuart Haig, whom Daniel had retained using funds from a joint account he had held with Margaret, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and the prosecution's timeline was constructed rather than discovered. He portrayed Daniel as a grieving son subjected to a rush to judgment by investigators fixated on financial motive at the expense of alternative explanations. He suggested the thallium could have entered Margaret's system through environmental contamination. The Verde Valley had historical copper mining activity, and trace heavy metals were not unknown in the region's soil and water. Diane Faulkner dismantled that argument in her rebuttal with a toxicologist from the University of Arizona who testified that the concentration and distribution pattern of thallium in Margaret's system was inconsistent with environmental exposure and consistent exclusively with repeated deliberate ingestion over a period of 8 to 12 weeks. The jury watched Daniel as the testimony was delivered. He sat with the attentiveness of someone following a lecture, rather than a man hearing the mechanism of his mother's murder described in clinical detail. He took notes occasionally on a legal pad. He whispered to his attorney at intervals. He did not look at the jury unless directly addressed. Several jurors would later say, during post-trial interviews, that his composure had unsettled them more than anything else. The forensic technician testified about the vial found above the refrigerator. The lab had confirmed its contents as thallium sulfate, chemically identical to the compound identified in Margaret's blood work. The Flagstaff mailbox attendant testified that Daniel had collected 3 packages personally across a 4-month period. A digital forensics analyst walked the jury through the darknet procurement records with the methodical patience of a teacher, explaining each transaction, each delivery, each message that referred to tea in terms that left no reasonable alternative interpretation. Then came the handwritten note. Diane Faulkner had saved it deliberately. She displayed it on the courtroom screen. A single sheet of ruled paper in Daniel's handwriting, 12 dates listed in a column from January to early May, each one followed by a small number. She asked the toxicologist to return to the stand. Together, they walked the jury through a correlation between the dates on the note and the estimated accumulation curve of thallium in Margaret's system as calculated from the autopsy results. The numbers on the note corresponded within reasonable margin to estimated dose intervals. Daniel Torres had been tracking his mother's poisoning in his own handwriting, on paper he kept in his nightstand, 4 feet from where he slept. Stuart Haig objected to the characterization. The judge sustained one procedural point and overruled everything else. Patricia Nunez testified on the 4th day. She described Margaret's final weeks, the diminishing energy, the paleness, the way she had seemed to be shrinking from the inside. She described the phone call she had made on Mother's Day evening, the unanswered rings, the drive to Mesquite Lane the following morning. She described finding Margaret in the bedroom, the gold earrings still on, the family photograph propped against the nightstand. She was asked whether Daniel had ever displayed behavior toward his mother that concerned her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No." That was what made it impossible to absorb. He had seemed, until the very end, like exactly what he claimed to be. The prosecution's final witness was Rosa Torres, Daniel's cousin, who had received his text message on Mother's Day evening. The one that read she seemed really tired today, more than usual. Rosa had initially cooperated with the defense framing, believing in Daniel the way the rest of the family had. But seated on the witness stand, reading her own messages on the screen, something shifted in her face. She answered Diane Faulkner's questions in a voice that grew quieter with each response, as though she were hearing something collapse from a great distance. Daniel's message, sent at 5:47 in the afternoon, had been composed while Margaret was already dying in the next room. He had used her deteriorating condition as documentation of natural decline, forwarded in real time to a family member who would later be able to confirm she had seemed unwell, if anyone asked. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. On the second afternoon, they returned. Daniel Torres stood when the foreperson rose. He held his legal pad against his chest. He looked at the foreperson with the same composed attention he had directed at witnesses throughout the trial. The foreperson read the verdict on the first count, guilty. Somewhere in the second row, Patricia Núñez closed her eyes. Daniel Torres did not change expression. He set the legal pad down on the defense table with the careful precision of someone who had not yet decided what came next. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Daniel did not acknowledge it. The courtroom was very quiet. Outside, the February sky over Prescott was the flat, pale gray of unfinished things. Sentencing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late March, 6 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom filled the same way it had throughout the trial, quietly, without drama, with the particular gravity of people who understood that what they were witnessing was not resolution, so much as the formal acknowledgement of an irreversible loss. Judge Caroline Whitmore had presided over the trial with a discipline that had impressed both sides. She was 61 years old, a former public defender who had spent the second half of her career on the bench, and she had a reputation for sentences that were neither performative nor lenient. She read case materials thoroughly. She listened to victim impact statements without interruption. She did not mistake severity for justice, but she did not confuse mercy with leniency either. The victim impact statements came first. Rosa Torres spoke on behalf of the family. She had written her statement by hand and revised it 4 times over the preceding weeks, crossing out sentences that felt too large and replacing them with ones that felt more true. She described what it had been like to grow up alongside Daniel, to admire him, to hold him up as an example of what a son could be. She described the specific moment during testimony when she had understood, fully and without remaining doubt, that the text message he sent her on Mother's Day evening had been calculated, that he had used her trust, used her grief as an instrument of his own protection. She did not look at Daniel while she read. She looked at Judge Whitmore. Patricia Núñez spoke next. She was 73 years old and had never addressed a courtroom before. She held her written statement in both hands and read it slowly, pausing occasionally when her voice required it. She spoke about Margaret's Wednesday mornings at the parish, about the way she arranged the food donation tables with unnecessary care because she believed that dignity mattered even in charitable transactions. She spoke about the gold earrings. She said she could not enter her own kitchen some mornings without thinking about a measuring spoon left on a counter and what it meant that she now understood why it had been there. She closed by saying that she hoped the court would ensure that Daniel Torres spent enough time in a cell to understand, in the most concrete terms available to the law, what it costs to destroy someone who loved you without reservation. Daniel was offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. His attorney had advised him privately that a statement expressing remorse might influence the judge's consideration. Daniel declined to speak. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes directed at a point slightly above Judge Whitmore's head, as though he were waiting for something other than what was about to happen. Judge Whitmore read her sentencing remarks for 11 minutes. She addressed the premeditation first. The evidence had established, beyond the threshold the law required, that Daniel Torres had planned his mother's death across a period of months, researching procurement methods, acquiring the substance through deliberate concealment, administering it in calculated intervals, and documenting his own process in handwriting he kept within arm's reach while he slept. She noted that the Mother's Day celebration had not been a spontaneous gesture of affection complicated by ulterior motive. It had been the final chapter of a plan. The flowers, the brunch, the framed photograph, the horchata prepared with particular care. Each element served the same function: to place him at the center of his mother's final day as a loving son, so that the story told afterward would be the one he had written in advance. She addressed the specific cruelty of the method. Thallium poisoning was not a sudden act committed in a moment of desperation. It was a prolonged process that caused suffering across weeks. Margaret Torres had experienced fatigue, nausea, and physical deterioration during the last months of her life without understanding its cause, without the ability to seek appropriate treatment, without the knowledge that the person preparing her food and refilling her coffee and sitting beside her on the porch was the source of everything she was enduring. She had spent her final months dying in the company of the person killing her, believing herself simply unwell. Judge Whitmore sentenced Daniel Ernesto Torres to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom did not erupt. There were no cries of relief or outrage. There was instead a long, collective exhale, the sound of a room full of people releasing something they had been holding since May of the previous year. Rosa Torres pressed her hands flat against her thighs. Patricia Nunez looked down at her lap. Dr. Yolanda Reyes, seated near the back, removed her glasses and cleaned them with the hem of her jacket, a gesture that had nothing to do with her glasses. Daniel was led from the courtroom by two officers. He did not turn around. He did not look at Rosa or Patricia or any of the faces that had known him across 31 years as something he had never actually been. He walked through the side door, and it closed behind him, and that was the last image the people of Clarkdale would carry of Daniel Torres. A straight back, a measured pace, a door swinging shut. Margaret's house on Mesquite Lane was eventually transferred to Rosa, who became the administrator of the estate. The life insurance claim was denied in full. The policy contained a standard exclusionary clause for deaths caused by a named beneficiary. The $250,000 Daniel had planned to collect, the sum that had made the entire architecture of deception necessary, remained with the insurer. Daniel received nothing. His debts remained. The collection proceedings continued against an empty account. The garden on Mesquite Lane went unattended through the summer and grew in the disorganized way that desert plants grow when left alone, slower than expected, more persistent than seems reasonable. By autumn, something Ernesto had planted years before along the back fence had come back without anyone asking it to, pushing through the dry ground with the indifference of things that do not require permission to survive. Patricia went by the house occasionally. She did not go inside. She stood at the fence and looked at the garden and thought about Margaret, who had always said that Ernesto's plants were stubborn in exactly the way he had been, quietly, productively, without apology. In the lobby of Stone Dental Practice on Main Street, Dr. Reyes placed a small framed photograph of Margaret beside the front desk. It was not an obituary notice or a memorial plaque. It was simply a photograph. Margaret at the office holiday party 2 years before her death, laughing at something just outside the frame, the same way she had laughed in the lake photograph Daniel had given her on the last day of her life. People who came into the office sometimes asked who she was. Dr. Reyes always answered the same way. She was the person who made this place worth coming to.